Welcome back, everyone, to the Nietzsche Podcast Book Club. We're going to jump right back in at section 21, entitled, To the Teachers of Selfishness. And before we get into it, remember the name of the section that began Book 1, that we discussed in the first episode of this series, To the Teachers of the Purpose of Existence. If we recall, the point of that first section was to argue that those who have purported to teach us a purpose for existence are only exhorting us to do what nature already does. That is, to live, to suffer, to procreate, and to perish. Life will do this regardless of whether it is given a so-called higher purpose, but man is now the type of animal that demands a moral or metaphysical purpose for his existence. But life, in fact, has no higher purpose other than itself. It is ruled by blind necessity, and even the teachers of a so-called higher purpose only serve nature's purposes thereby, by tricking us into living. So the teachers of the purpose of existence, teachers of a telos to existence, are actually serving life, which is in itself totally unteleological. So too, in this passage, section 21, there is a parallel structure to the thought of Nietzsche here. Those who have purported to teach us to act as selfless moral agents are in fact preaching a doctrine which is selfish in the highest degree. All such moralists, unbeknownst to them, have been the servants of selfish and tyrannical nature, in spite of their attempts to impose an anti-natural morality. So let's go through the passage. I'm going to read the whole thing, abridged in a couple places, and then we'll interpret it. Quote, "A man's virtues are called good, depending on their probable consequences, not for him, but for us and society. The praise of virtues has always been far from selfless, far from unegoistic. Otherwise, one would have had to notice that virtues, like industriousness, obedience, chastity, filial piety, and justice, are usually harmful for those who possess them, being instincts that dominate them too violently and covetously, and resist the efforts of reason to keep them in balance with their other instincts. When you have a virtue, a real whole virtue, and not merely a mini instinct for some virtue, you are its victim. But your neighbor praises your virtue precisely on that account. One praises the industrious even though they harm their eyesight or the spontaneity and freshness of their spirit. One honors and feels sorry for the youth who has worked himself into the ground because one thinks, for society as a whole, the loss of even the best individual is merely a small sacrifice. One feels sorry for the youth not for his own sake, but because a devoted instrument, ruthless against itself, a so-called good man, has been lost to society by his death. Perhaps one gives some thought to the question whether it would have been more useful for society if he had been less ruthless against himself and had preserved himself longer. One admits that there would have been some advantage in that, but one considers the other advantage, that a sacrifice has been made and that the attitude of the sacrificial animal has once again been confirmed for all to see, greater and of more lasting significance. Thus, what is really praised when virtues are praised is first their instrumental nature, and secondly the instinct in every virtue that refuses to be held in check by the overall advantage for the individual himself. In sum, the unreason in virtue that leads the individual to allow himself to be transformed into a mere function of the whole. The praise of virtue is the praise of something that is privately harmful. The praise of instincts that deprive a human being of his noblest selfishness and the strength for the highest autonomy. To be sure, for educational purposes and to lead men to incorporate virtuous habits, one emphasizes effects of virtue that make it appear as if virtue and private advantage were sisters, and some such relationship actually exists. Blindly raging industriousness, for example, this typical virtue of an instrument, is represented as the way to wealth and honor, and as the poison that best cures boredom and the passions. But one keeps silent about its dangers, its extreme dangerousness. That is how education always proceeds. One tries to condition an individual by various attractions and advantages to adopt a way of thinking and behaving that, once it has become a habit, instinct and passion will dominate him to his own ultimate disadvantage, but for the general good. How often I see that blindly raging industriousness does create wealth and reap honors, while at the same time depriving the organs of their subtlety, which alone would make possible the enjoyment of wealth and honors. If this education succeeds, then every virtue of an individual is a public utility and a private disadvantage, measured against the supreme private goal, probably some impoverishment of the spirit and the senses, or even a premature decline. The praise of the selfless, the self-sacrificial, the virtuous, that is, of those who do not apply their whole strength and reason to their own preservation, development, elevation, promotion, and the expansion of their power, but rather live, in relation to themselves, modestly and thoughtlessly, perhaps even with indifference or irony, this praise certainly was not born from the spirit of selflessness. The neighbor praises selflessness because it brings him advantages. If the neighbor himself were selfless in his thinking, he would repudiate this diminution of strength, this mutilation for his benefit. He would work against the development of such inclinations, and above all, he would manifest his selflessness by not calling it good. This indicates the fundamental contradiction in the morality that is very prestigious nowadays. The motives of this morality stand opposed to its principle. What this morality considers its proof is refuted by its criterion of what is moral. In order not to contravene its own morality, the demand, "You shall renounce yourself and sacrifice yourself," could be laid down only by those who thus renounced their own advantage and perhaps brought about their own destruction through the demanded sacrifice of individuals. But as soon as the neighbor, or society, recommends altruism for the sake of its utility, it applies the contradictory principle. You shall seek your advantage even at the expense of everything else, and thus one preaches in the same breath a thou shalt and thou shalt not. End quote. So the overall point of this passage is to illustrate something that Nietzsche has long alleged throughout his whole career, that a virtue such as selflessness must be understood as itself derived from selfishness. That it is selfish to ask others to be selfless. And he demonstrates that rather clearly here, but let's go over the many points raised in the passage and make a few observations to see how he gets there. First of all, Nietzsche says to possess a real virtue, a whole virtue, is to be its victim. In other words, we might have any number of virtues of greater or lesser strength, but a virtue that is allowed to wholly manifest, to manifest its entire strength, will then tyrannize over one's whole character. In some sense, we could understand the virtues here as another way of talking about the drives. Virtues are a type of drive. The main difference between the virtues and the other drives is that virtues are the drives which represent some sort of power or strength that one possesses, and also there's a very important element of habit, which always forms the foundation of virtue that Nietzsche mentions in this passage. So certain patterns of behavior, certain character traits which we are encouraged to hold, after a long while they become habitual, and we call them virtues. And we might understand all the drives as being either strengthened or lessened by their habitual reinforcement or lack thereof. And obviously these drives that become habituated are not necessarily beneficial. Typically we only call the ones virtues which are beneficial to ourselves, or as Nietzsche points out here, which are beneficial to society at large. So a habit that's entirely aimed at one's own destruction, like a drug addiction, this is not a virtue, mainly because it's not a strength. It's still habitual, but it doesn't benefit yourself or society in any way. And we might imagine there could be virtues which benefit both oneself and benefit all of society. Nietzsche mentions here, industriousness can be very beneficial. There's a trade-off there, right, which we'll get to in a moment, but it can bring you wealth and honors and so on and so forth while benefiting society. But Nietzsche's significant allegation here is that a culture, a society promotes virtues because of the calculation that it benefits society, without regard for whether it benefits the individual, and in fact, usually, those virtues that do benefit society at large are harmful to the individual, and society doesn't much care about that, because the individual is a mere instrument in the hands of society for the sake of the whole. Another observation, just as the drug addict is out of control in the sense that his habitual behaviors seem to act on their own, independently of his will, or at the very least, you have to bring like a considerable effort of willing in order to overcome such a habit, Nietzsche applies this as well to the positive habits, the virtues. The virtue is in charge. The virtue is what has agency. So that is the sense in which to possess a whole virtue is to be its victim, because if a certain habit of thought or behavior is so totalizing that it comes to define you. It comes to be your defining trait, perhaps, a part of your identity, such that you say, I'm a hard-working man. That's how you see yourself and define yourself and understand yourself. Nietzsche's argument would be that that trait of being hardworking is the virtue that you are a victim of. That is what has agency, that drive to industriousness, or whatever we might call it. That habitual mode of being is what is active. Everything else about you is subordinated to this. And so virtues are praised for their instrumental nature. They're good because they're good to society, to the herd. And oftentimes, virtue does give private advantage, but it also has its dangers. And to speak concretely about this, the hardworking, productive man who has internalized and habituated this virtue of industriousness, well, any number of things might happen, but one possibility for his life might be high blood pressure, or a poor diet because he never has time for a healthy meal, or improper sleep. I mean, it shouldn't be hard to imagine, especially in America, the example of someone that is so committed to the hustle culture, working as hard as they can, perhaps for the noble cause of supporting their family, giving them a good life. But the toll taken on their health shortens their life in the end, right? That's, I would say, probably a very common story. And so why would the virtue of industriousness, being as productive and hardworking as you possibly can, why would that be promoted by the herd? Is it for the private advantage that the virtue gives? Because again, to use industriousness as the example, there is an advantage to that virtue. It does enrich people. It does make them advance in status. Well, Nietzsche's argument is simply that whether or not the culture appeals to that fact, this personal advantage granted by being productive, at least oftentimes, right? There's no guarantees in life, but oftentimes it's true. Well, still, that's not the reason why society at large promotes it. The reason why it's promoted in that way is because that's the most effective rhetorical approach that the herd has at its disposal. And so in truth, the virtues that are praised are all the virtues that turn the individual into a mere function. When you act according to the virtues that society deems beneficial, you're no longer an end. Your own goals are no longer your ends, we might say, your final cause or your purpose. When you live a life according to the virtues preached by the broader culture, then your final cause, your purpose, becomes the purpose of serving that broader culture. You become a servant of the collective, a function of the collective. We might say a servant of the people, or a good Samaritan, or a philanthropist. These are the various modern terms for a good man, right? The man who makes himself a function of the greater good. And I want to examine industriousness in a bit more detail because it is so common a virtue in modern American life. It's probably one of the most relatable social attitudes that Nietzsche discusses, in fact, just in terms of the contemporary situation in modern-day America in the 2020s. We've all been raised in this culture of being hardworking, of being productive, being of service to other people, being conscientious, and so on. Well, Nietzsche often seems at war with industriousness throughout many of these passages. And why would that be? Well, because it's a symptomatic virtue of the modern age. It's almost definitive of the modern attitude towards life. Industriousness is inevitably modern because it's a timely virtue. The industrious person is concerned with punctuality. They're concerned with productive output at a certain rate of time. They're interested in compacting as much productivity as possible into as little time as possible. You could put it like that. And so industriousness is a hyperactive virtue, like much of modernity, which is, it's characterized by excessive activity, excessive stimulation. The industrious man is overstimulated. He's exhausted by the strenuous pace of life. His focus is always on now, even as he scales up the hierarchy of modern workers, such that at the bottom of the rung and at the top, we find the same thing. I mean, the CEO's mind is never that far from his money. It's never that far from the quarterly reports. Nietzsche's fundamental critique of industriousness here is that it's driven by the pursuit of personal advantage and that it often does succeed in granting this. We might remember in the episodes when we discussed the Nietzschean critique of capitalism that he made a similar point, that the horror of capitalism isn't that it fails, but that it succeeds. That the profit motive does effectively raise people out of poverty and bring wealth to the whole society and empower competent individuals who are good at making a profit, regardless of their background or whatever other traits or virtues they might have. And it eventually, that profit motive overwhelms all the other incentive structures and values that are healthy to a society. And so the productive man The industrious man is this same story on the micro scale, on the scale of a single life. The average person, by the very nature of having drilled the habits of industriousness into his soul, doesn't know what to do with privilege and wealth. When you become industrious as a second nature, you're not happy in your leisure time. All you can do is work. You can never stop and truly enjoy the possibility of leisure. Such a person doesn't know what to do with it. And so, in the same way that the warlike man turns upon himself in times of peace, the industrious man turns upon himself in times of leisure. He can't go long without feeling productive. His life it's become instrumental in that way. He's a mere instrument of society or of the economy. And when he's untethered from those duties, he's not set free, he's simply set adrift. And meanwhile, as part of the effect of living a life of industriousness upon the physiology, well, Nietzsche says impoverishment of the senses, premature decline. You waste your eyes and ears working at a factory and reading fine print or staring at screens or looking through a microscope. Really, any kind of labor that one has to do in order to survive, especially when it's undertaken in this, industrial or post-industrial economy. And the stress and overstimulation, the constant states of exhaustion, you end up physiologically wasting yourself, spending yourself. But what does Nietzsche say earlier? Well, we praise the selfless and the self-sacrificial. And that's because there's something about sacrifice that is affirming to the herd morality. So many of our stories are about sacrifice on behalf of the greater good of the whole collective. And this is true in the mythology found all over the world. It's even true here in the supposedly more individualist West. I mean, we have that story in the form of Jesus, right? Our supreme individualists, like Jordan Peterson, say that we should be individuals in order that we can take up our cross and live our lives in service to others, trying to reduce suffering. So we should all be individuals in service of the Christian virtues of selflessness. Nietzsche's counterpoint to this is that society at large demands altruism, promotes self-sacrifice, and so on, in order to obtain its own benefit. And whose benefit are we talking about when discussing society at large? I mean, how can we talk about the benefit of the collective as a whole? Well, what we mean is the lowest common denominator of society, who have only an average set of virtues, and so an average level of productivity, an average sense of duty or obligation. That's who benefits the most from promoting this selfless ideology. And so it's simply better for the average person to disseminate the idea that we all ought to be self-sacrificing and of service to others. Because then the person who is hyper-competent and very intelligent and who determines he could benefit himself in some way that perhaps harms a great many of those average people, maybe they will think twice if they internalize these values of selflessness. They'll consider it heroic not to act on those predatory instincts that perhaps a true individualist might follow. And, it must be said, a great many people in society still act that way. They still act according to those predatory instincts. But the point is simply that the promotion of the virtues that are selfless is a kind of trick of the collective, made up of mostly average people, obviously, and it's to their benefit. It's not actually selfless of them to promote it. Strictly from the standpoint of objective advantage, of what gives material wealth or status to someone, being selfless would be to the detriment of the competent, intelligent individual. So the herd demands that we all become selfless. It's for their own selfish benefit that we do so. And so that's why, in Nietzsche's view, perhaps, as he mentions at the end of this passage, perhaps an individual such as Christ, what does he say? That somebody who renounced their own advantage and perhaps brought about their own destruction through the demanded sacrifice of individuals. So somebody like Christ himself would have the right to say that a life of, selfless martyrdom and suffering on the behalf of others is the correct way to live, because he's actually put his money where his mouth is, so to speak. But the moment one's neighbor demands altruism, or we might say society at large demands it, we have to recognize that this is only because of the utility of spreading the selfless attitude. They're just using you. The truly good person wouldn't have to say that his own act was selfless. He wouldn't feel the need to call selflessness good at all. If your neighbor were equally selfless, he wouldn't exalt you to become selfless, because he would be selfless enough to forgive you for your selfishness, and so on and so forth. It's always a hypocrisy to call for others to be selfless, except in the rare cases that the one calling for it is manifestly so. In other words, a saint. And how often do we encounter those types of people in reality? Okay, let's move on to section 22. The title of this section is in French. The meaning in English, the translation, is the order of the day for the king. Quote, "The day begins. Let us begin to order for this day the business and the festivals of our most merciful master, who is still deigning to rest. His Majesty has bad weather today. We shall be careful not to call it bad. We shall not speak of the weather, but we shall be a little more solemn about our business than would otherwise be necessary, and a little more festive about festivals. Perhaps His Majesty will even be ill. At breakfast, we shall present the latest good news of the preceding evening, the arrival of I.21, who jokes so agreeably about his illness. He suffers from a stone. We shall receive a few persons, and this reception will take longer than anybody finds agreeable. That is reason enough to tell of the poet who wrote on his door, 'Whoever enters here honors me. Whoever does not pleases me.' What a courteous way of expressing a discourtesy. And perhaps this poet is altogether right to be discourteous. It is said that his poems are better than the poet. Let him write many more then, and withdraw from the world as much as possible, which is, after all, the meaning of his civil incivility. Conversely, a prince is always worth more than his verse, even if— But what am I saying? We are chatting, and the whole court thinks that we are already at work and racking our brains. There is no window in which anyone ever sees a light burn before ours. Listen, wasn't that the bell? Damn! The day and the dance begin, and we don't know the schedule. We have to improvise. All the world improvises its day. Let us proceed today as all the world does." At that, my strange morning dream vanished. Probably a victim of the hard strokes of the tower clock, which announced the 5th hour with all its accustomed gravity. It seems to me that on this occasion the god of dreams was pleased to make fun of my habit of beginning the day by ordering it and making it tolerable for myself, and it is possible that I have sometimes done this too formally, as if I were a prince." End quote. I'd be interested in any Freudian or Jungian interpretations of Nietzsche's dream here, from any commenters. I mean, first of all, this shows the thoroughly anti-systematic approach of Nietzsche, that this book is a work of art. This is a book dictated by a muse. Nietzsche is effortlessly transitioning between different styles of writing here. And so here we have basically a dream journal. And the dream is fairly simple. We're seeing from the perspective of some servants who are planning the day of a prince, who get carried away in conversation, talking about the court poet in his verse, the verse that whoever enters the court honors me and whoever does not pleases me. And then the bell rings. And it's time for the meetings of the court and for the dance that has been planned. All of this has to get underway, and we haven't planned the schedule yet. We'll just have to improvise. But all the world improvises their day, so we will proceed as all the world does. Nietzsche interprets his dream as such that he so fastidiously plans his day, perhaps he could stand to loosen up a bit, that he arranges his meetings and schedules and his social events with the rigor of a prince's court. Perhaps his unconsciousness is telling him, would it be so bad if you improvised every once in a while? Why does Nietzsche convey this dream to us? First, there's another interesting tidbit, actually, that he mentions I.29 stopping by in the dream. He's one of the planned guests. And that certainly makes sense, as Montaigne is a nobleman. He is the kind of person who would be summoned to the court of a prince. But one of the details of the dream is that the prince is ill, the weather is bad today. Those are clearly aspects of Nietzsche's waking life. He felt that his physiological illness was often very acutely affected by the weather. And there's a kind of subtext to the dream of Montaigne visiting this other previous philosophical figure who also suffered from an illness, in this case from kidney stones, which he repeatedly and painfully had to pass. He did this while visiting all the spas and hot springs in Western Europe. He keeps a travelogue where he talks about pissing out all of his kidney stones. And so what does Nietzsche say? He says, well, he jokes so agreeably about his illness. He takes this very serious malady rather lightly. And it's as if the expected meeting with Monsieur de Montaigne, with the prince who is himself ill, literally under the weather, is a kind of comfort. It's an example, Montaigne provides an example of how one bears one's illness, bears the suffering of life with good humor. And we already know that Montaigne was an influence on Nietzsche. You can go back and listen to the episode we did last season on Montaigne for more on that. And so I'm not certain whether this kind of connection was even conscious to Nietzsche or if it was just a part of the dream, but I suspect this is part of why he considered the dream so profound as to think of sharing it in his book. And I would just characterize this section as an artistic inclusion because of the attitude that it conveys. Enter or do not. And that applies to Nietzsche's whole philosophy. You either honor Nietzsche as a follower by entering, or you please him. You still make him happy if you're the one who knows that this is not for you, and you should not enter into Nietzsche's philosophy, that you should pass by. And so Nietzsche's dream is something he interprets as perhaps a message from his unconscious, that he ought to take his daily affairs a bit less seriously and more improvisationally. And in terms of the content of the dream, he also has an attitude very unlike many philosophers. He's not trying to be a universal apostle for his truth and convince the whole world of it. Many people can and should pass Nietzsche by. And so that whole spirit comes through in this passage as well. What he's conveying in telling us his dream and his interpretation of it is the carefree nature of this book and the philosophy behind the book. And the very willingness to mix styles the way that Nietzsche does is another expression of that carefreeness. And I think you will need precisely that kind of carefree attitude to approach the following passage in section 23. It's entitled Signs of Corruption, and it's a direct plunge into the serious topic of the decline and fall of civilizations. And so I think these two aphorisms, placed back to back like this, are so illustrative of Nietzsche's approach, because the recounting of his dream and a meta-historical interpretation are two very different things that don't really inform one another at all in terms of subject matter. On the other hand, it's as if some of these sections are a reminder of the devil-may-care attitude that's been promoted throughout the book so far, a sort of wink and a nod. The previous aphorism, the one we just read, is a wink and a nod, and now Nietzsche is going to talk about an extremely dire topic, and so we should be aware of the fact he does not take this topic with that kind of grave seriousness, the kind of pearl-clutching that the moralists bring to the issue. That doesn't mean that Nietzsche is personally indifferent. He makes his own value judgments. He recognizes, rightly, in my opinion, that decadence, corruption, the decline of one's society and culture is a dreadful thing. It's a calamitous thing. It's something nobody wants to live through. The people who talk about accelerating to the end of society so we can rush headlong into it, I think are being a bit too blasé in their valuations. So the point here is not to be glib. The point, however, is to accept the reality and treat it with a kind of humor, therefore, the way that Montaigne treats his own illness with good humor, as does Nietzsche. It's still a terrible illness. It's not good to have days-long migraines and be unable to eat food because of constant vomiting for weeks on end. Nobody would wish for that. But if that is the reality for you, you can either weep about it or you can confront it with humor. Or I guess, there's other options. You could confront it with stoical indifference or something like that. But Nietzsche chooses humor, and so that applies to on the civilizational scale. That's what we're going to talk about now. So, section 23, the signs of corruption. Quote, "Consider the following signs of those states of society which are necessary from time to time and which are designated with the word corruption. As soon as corruption sets in anywhere, superstition becomes rank, and the previous faith of a people becomes pale and powerless against it. For superstition is second-order free spirit. Those who surrender to it choose certain forms and formulas that they find congenial and permit themselves some freedom of choice. Whoever is superstitious is always, compared with the religious human being, much more of a person. And a superstitious society is one in which there are many individuals and much delight in individuality. In this perspective, superstition always appears as progress and as a sign that the intellect is becoming more independent and demands its rights. Those who then complain of corruption are the adherents of the old religion and religiosity, and they have also determined linguistic usage hitherto and given superstition a bad reputation even among the freest spirits. Let us realize that it is actually a symptom of enlightenment." End quote. So this is a phenomenon that's been noted before by social scientists, among others. You often have the rise of new religious movements, and typically lots of sects and previously heretical ideas. These all gain purchase during a time of social and economic decline and political decline. I think the reason for this is self-explanatory. The old system of belief is clearly not working or must have been flawed in some way, because look at how bad things are now. That's sort of the reasoning. That's how the human mind works. If the belief system led us to this, clearly there must be something wrong with it. And it's usually not going to take the form of people just converting wholesale to a new religion. You might get new wacky religious movements within the existing religious narratives. So for example, in today's society, we have the New Age movement. It's sort of like hyper-individualistic spirituality, which dabbles in the beliefs and ideas of dozens of religions from all over the world, mixing them together, picking and choosing what they want. There's that great line in Big Trouble in Little China. Egg Shen says, we take what we want and leave the rest, like your salad bar. That's his description of like Chinese spirituality or whatever, which I'm sure is apocryphal, but I think it applies very, very well to New Age spirituality and to, universalist and liberal styles of Christianity. But I think there's another phenomenon here that might be more apropos to the modern world, and that would be the rise of conspiracy theories, which I think just springs out of a wholesale rejection of scientific consensus. That's the way I would kind of understand it, is that the scientific consensus became, in a way, a sort of a new religion, in the way that Nietzsche thinks in the wake of the death of God. We still have all of these values, and those get laundered into a mechanistic secular worldview, and we kind of get this utilitarianism backed up by scientific positivism, and we have these institutions of higher learning that become a new priesthood, so to speak. And so the heresy against that would be conspiracy thinking. And there's that sense that, well, all of those old institutions and all the experts, they'll lie at the behest of the power structure, so no one believes anything anymore. And in that kind of mindset, it becomes plausible, well, maybe there was a world-spanning empire called Tartaria, or whatever the theory might be. And I would say of all of this, it's easy to dismiss this as pseudoscience, but it all comes, I think, as a reaction to the failures of conventional scientific institutions, or mainstream science, whatever we want to call it. The failures to correct for some of the fundamental problems that lead institutional power astray. Corrupting incentives, groupthink, motivated reasoning, bias towards the existing consensus, arrogance when communicating with outsiders to the institution, and so on and so forth. I mean, people always want to point at conspiracy thinking as the problem, but I would regard it as a symptom, right? And whenever the explanation just ends with like, well, it's because people are stupid, to me, that just shows you don't want to confront the real root of the problem, because the problem is actually with you, with the science communicators, the existing institutions of science. That's who has allowed that to happen. In the same way that when Nietzsche says, when the Ancien regime delegitimized itself and no longer fulfilled the noblesse oblige and lived in the mold of these sacred duties and the virtues of the old nobility, the French Revolution was a foregone conclusion at that point. And similarly, a kind of individualist revolution against the consensus of our institutions of reason becomes guaranteed once those institutions are perceived as corrupt or unreliable in some way. And so, if scientific positivism is the ideology that functionally replaced the old traditional religions, I would say conspiracy theories and pseudoscience are kind of a similar movement to New Age. It's very democratic in a way. It's very individualistic. Basically, everyone goes out to seek their own scientific truth or find it in their own little wacky subculture rather than seeking it in the mainstream, because the mainstream has become suspect. Or rather, Nietzsche says that it will be the freest spirits who go down this path, so to speak. And that's the funny thing. A lot of the people who become New Age or get into conspiracy theories or whatever, they're not stupid. A lot of them are some of the smartest people around. It's usually the more intelligent people who move out of that sort of centrist consensus reality and start poking around at the fringes, because they at least have enough of an intellectual conscience to recognize the flaws in the consensus truth claims. And so there is a value to this kind of rebellion against the consensus, at least insofar as the superstitious people, as Nietzsche calls them, will be the freest spirits around. So when a society starts to go into decline, the old sacred values are called into question. The practical manifestation of this is superstition, meaning as your society is on the decline, you see a rise of these superstitious beliefs, which are a more fractured and individualistic expression of religion or spirituality. I mean, Pliny basically said this about the Christians, by the way, that they were incredibly superstitious. And of course, he would think this because most of the Roman pagans by this time are not even really keeping up with the old rites and sacrifices, at least not like they used to. A lot of them are Epicureans by his time. They don't even believe in the traditional stories of the afterlife. The philosophers had more or less reshaped the mental world of classical antiquity, and the theoretical had triumphed over the tragic, as Nietzsche would have put it. And so the upside of this was that, in Nietzsche's view, the Epicureans triumphed over all of those subterranean cults of the pagan world that believed in the immortal soul and reward and punishment for the soul after death. But what happens with the decline and fall of Roman society? Well, that belief system comes back with a vengeance in the form of Christianity. And suddenly people during Pliny's time are worried about all sorts of rules and commandments for living that the pagans had long since forgotten about. And so Christianity itself, the various early sects of Christianity, are a historical example of this same phenomenon. But arguably we see it even today, albeit in a new and different form. So let's go back to the text. Quote, "Second, a society in which corruption spreads is accused of exhaustion. And it is obvious that the esteem for war and the pleasure in war diminish, while the comforts of life are now desired just as ardently as warlike and athletic honors were formerly. But what is generally overlooked is that the ancient national energy and national passion that became gloriously visible in war and warlike games have now been transmuted into countless private passions and have merely become less visible. Indeed, in times of corruption, the power and force of the national energies that are expended are probably greater than ever, and the individual squanders them as lavishly as he could not have formerly when he was simply not yet rich enough. Thus, it is precisely in times of exhaustion that tragedy runs through houses and streets, that great love and great hatred are born, and that the flame of knowledge flares up into the sky." End quote. And a brief aside about this. This is akin to what John Glubb says in his essay, The Fate of Empires. The empire that is established by martial traits, by military organization, the use of organized violence, often in an aggressive and expansive posture, becomes more concerned with knowledge, the arts and sciences. That's what the national energy is spent upon. Institutions of learning are funded, city walls are constructed, and if the empire needs defense, it hires auxiliaries. This was also the case with Rome, this entire pattern. This is one reason why the sprawling metropolises of antiquity are steadily replaced during this time by the walled cities that would come to define the Middle Ages. That trend began in the time of the Romans, when the lands of Italy are no longer safe. They're no longer pacified by the legions. They could be raided at any time. They kind of retreat into their cities. The people of this time will say, it's not as though we're afraid to fight, but that we should consider it immoral to do so. To conquer and expand becomes seen as evil. The empire becomes concerned with holding on to what it already has. And importantly, Nietzsche says that all of those qualities that formerly fueled those martial energies that were part of the national energy, they become more individualistic as well. Nietzsche says that instead, we fulfill countless private passions, and again, the flame of knowledge flares up into the sky. So the energy is redirected into the realm of the mind, and it becomes less coherent. The national energy doesn't cohere throughout the entire society. It becomes more, again, fractured. So the story so far is that first we see the rise of superstition, and then the society becomes less warlike, goes into a defensive posture. The energy that they expend is intellectual. Back to the passage, quote, "Third, it is usually said, as if one wanted to make up for the reproaches of superstition and exhaustion, that such times of corruption are gentler, and that cruelty declines drastically compared with the older, stronger age that was more given to faith. But this praise I cannot accept any more than those reproaches. All I concede is that cruelty now becomes more refined, and that its older forms henceforth offend the new taste. But the art of wounding and torturing others with words and looks reaches its supreme development in times of corruption. It is only now that malice and the delight in malice are born. The men of corruption are witty and slanderous. They know of types of murder that require neither daggers nor assault. They also know that whatever is said well is believed." End quote. This is an exceedingly important aspect of Nietzsche's thought, sublimation. In this case, the sublimation of cruelty. So Nietzsche rejects the notion that people in corrupt ages, in these times of decline that are ostensibly more peaceful, or at least less outwardly warlike, that the people actually become less cruel. He says that in fact they sublimate their cruelty. Maybe they even heighten their capacity to be cruel. They're cruel instead with their words, with things like personal attacks or character assassination. And does any of that sound familiar to our own society? This is a kind of, what we call it, is kind of stimulation, a kind of combat or struggle that the modern person in this superstitious and exhausted society can still enjoy. We can cut another with words, we can duel with arguments, we manipulate, we spread rumors, we cast aspersions, we make moral and social judgments and do it publicly as a means of condemning or attacking others. And we can even do it beautifully. Most of us are familiar with the term murdered by words. That's quite literally what Nietzsche's talking about here. And, people who like that sort of thing, they enjoy seeing a well-constructed, even beautiful exercise in destroying a person. And I think Nietzsche's right. This is an outlet for the kind of cruelty that we have in previous times, given vent to by more physical means. Not by character assassination, but by real assassination, and real duels and real executions. The reason why this idea of sublimation is so important, though, is that it might be easy to misunderstand Nietzsche and think that his point is simply, we've become soft, we've become too nice in this modern age, something like that. We need to become mean and cruel again. But no, that's not his point. We're already mean and cruel. That doesn't go away. That's buying into the rhetoric of the modern morality, the lies of modern morality. I mean, if we consider the slave morality itself, people get really worked up on either side of this argument, you might call it, about the idea of returning to the master morality. Is Nietzsche really saying we should return to a morality in which we hurt other people without thinking of it? Or where we don't experience pity? Or we don't feel bad about killing or enslaving, and so on and so forth? Well, my counter-argument to this is that the slave morality as Nietzsche understands it, which is historically embodied in the form of Christianity, that's the historical form of the slave revolt and morality, and the rise of Christendom in Europe, therefore, is the sort of the fruition, or the coming to fruition of those values. Did the slave morality, therefore, abolish these things? Cruelty, war, genocide, so on and so forth. No. Europeans continued to do this. They continued to hurt people and enslave people and kill people without feeling bad about it. We kept doing all the same things that the people of the master morality did, only now we justify those things morally. And that actually makes human existence worse, because we layer on top of those physical torments, psychological torments. For example, hell and damnation and judgment day. The idea of living under the reign of a vengeful, judgmental God. The idea that all pleasure in life should come with a sense of guilt and should therefore be constantly deadened so that we can flee from all worldly pleasure, turn away from the world. So does the slave morality actually change the world to become more morally good? No, it doesn't. What it actually does when it triumphs is introduce suffering, psychological suffering. It makes life look less appealing. And whereas we might say the master morality didn't need any justification for what it did, the slave morality does all the same things. It just says, but I have a justification. I have a moral justification. And we see this all the time. I mean, you could look at the Catholic Church massacring the Albigensians. You could look at the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, I know these are sort of old hat, like very commonly, widely known sort of atheist talking points. The point here is not to make an argument for atheism, though. The point is simply to say that if you think that these values of humility and piety and charity and so on and so forth actually resulted in that substantive change to human nature, human behavior, that's just simply incorrect. That's not what happened. And what we find is that people are incredibly good at justifying any harmful thing that they want to do with their moral framework, the moral software that they're running. And as it turns out, usually their morality says, oh, hey, it turns out that I was right to do everything that I did. Right? So that's why I have so little patience with these moral realist arguments. The fact that there are still these moral realists out there, because it literally has nothing to do with anything practical or productive as far as like the human condition. It's just masturbatory in that way. This gets us a little bit off the track, but I think the point is made that cruelty is not something that has gone away in human nature, in spite of all of the teachers of the purpose of existence or the teachers of selflessness, who are actually teachers of selfishness. All of the morality as anti-nature has never gotten rid of that. And we might ask ourselves, bring the question to mind, why that is. So does Nietzsche actually stand for cruelty, whereas our modern morality is against cruelty? Well, in terms of the morality that is consciously articulated, yes. But in practice, no, it's no different. We're just as cruel. And the only thing that changes is the outlet for that cruelty, the particular form that it takes. Okay, let's go back and finish out this passage. Quote, "Fourth, when morals decay, those men emerge whom one calls tyrants. They are the precursors and, as it were, the precocious harbingers of individuals. Only a little while later, this fruit of fruits hangs yellow and mellow from the tree of a people, and the tree existed only for the sake of these fruits. Once decay has reached its climax, along with the infighting of all sorts of tyrants, the Caesar always appears, the final tyrant, who puts an end to the weary struggle for sole rule by putting weariness to work for himself. In his age, the individual is usually ripest, and culture therefore in its highest and most fruitful stage, but not for his sake or on account of him, although the men of the highest culture like to flatter their Caesar by pretending to be his creation. But in truth, they merely need peace from outside because they have enough unrest and work inside themselves." End quote. Actually, we're not going to finish the passage just yet because I have a couple comments to make on this paragraph too. So the last sign of a society's decline is the arrival of tyrants. And I think Nietzsche is heavily influenced by the classical authors here, the progression they saw between the forms of government and how governance naturally deteriorates. And tyranny is one of those deteriorated forms of government. It's sort of like the degenerated form of monarchy, but historically it comes as the natural end of democracies. That in the view of many of the classical conservative authors, democracy just turns the behavior of the masses toward using the state to reappropriate wealth for their own advantage. The way that Fustel de Coulanges describes this is that essentially the state was all powerful in ancient Greece. The government of the polis, the city-state, basically knew no limits. There was no notion of individual liberty. So as soon as you had these democratic revolutions where people just say, well, by a majoritarian vote, we're going to take your property, or we're going to cancel all the debts, or we're going to exile all of our enemies and just take all of their houses, right? We can vote to do that. We see no problem with this. They didn't have these Republican notions that we have today, or to the extent that those notions existed, sort of believing that there were certain sacrosanct boundaries or laws. That was exactly the thing that had gone into decline and become questionable, because all of those sort of sacrosanct guidelines that did exist in Greek society were all based on religion. And that's part of the broader narrative here. Nietzsche discusses this a great deal in his dissertation on Theognis, and it kind of ripples throughout his entire work, that once the sacred and unquestionable religious rules and social mores, once those are sort of chipped away at, by the rise of philosophy and a materialist worldview, the state becomes something, it's just a tool for power. It's just a weapon to be wielded for the sake of power. And, this isn't to cast moral aspersions necessarily. I mean, Nietzsche says the thing driving both the socialist and the man of wealth, the reactionary, is the same spirit, the spirit to possess, to acquire. They're just expressing that spirit from different sides, right? One, in the case of the man who has, and in the other case, the man who wants, who does not have. But it's ultimately the same thing driving them. And so this is a very brutal, cynical, realpolitik way of looking at the state, but it is historically documented in the ancient world that this often happened. Democracies rose up in the city-states. People would use those democracies simply to enrich themselves. This sort of created a chaotic situation of factionalism, and the next step would be the tyrant. And the tyrants sort of rise up, and their rule is entirely premised upon rewarding their followers and punishing the enemies of their followers. And arguably, we can even see this pattern in some examples in the 20th century. I mean, there's a curious funnel from democratic movements toward autocratic movements. You'd think that if a democracy devolved, it would become a kind of oligarchic, bureaucratic rule by nature. But instead, what you seem to get is tyrants. Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, some would say FDR in America, although I probably would not go that far. But certainly one of the strongest presidents we've ever had in America, probably the most power the executive branch ever possessed. And it was a very democratic moment that led to that, right? But that was also during a time of crisis that kind of created a yearning for a new alignment and a new center to the society to be established, for any kind of order to be established to rein in the chaos of the moment. And so as it always happens, in the end, a democratic people begs for the coup, so to speak. And if you want to take it back before the 20th century, Napoleon is the eternal example of this, as is Julius Caesar, whom Nietzsche mentioned. But notice in these steps of progression, right, Nietzsche is seeing how corruption on all of these four stages has been an increase in atomization. And is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Well, we'll get to that at the end of the passage. But things, so we have sort of religion becoming more individualistic, more relegated to the individual reason. And then next, the passions or the direction of energy becoming more individualized, the countless private passions, the pursuits of the mind, which is a more solitary or small-scale behavior or activity, rather than this sort of collective, unified, organized violence of the entire society, the energy becoming national, right, the entire group. And then cruelty, the democratization of cruelty, we might say, everyone getting to have their little enjoyment out of cruelty that they can derive through murdering people with words. And then here, the entire political realm becomes atomized or fractured in that way, becomes rife with factionalism, and then you have these tyrants who basically use the state in order to reward and punish. And the political realm, basically the question becomes, what can you do for me? What can I get out of this? And so at every step, corruption, decadence, decline is sort of synonymous with democratization, atomization, individualization, privatization. All of these terms which we, in some cases, have a positive association with in the modern West. Democracy, individualism. If you're on the right wing, you probably like the idea of privatizing things. If you're on the left wing, you probably like the idea of democratizing things. Nietzsche actually sees those as sort of the same thing, just in different realms of human activity. The point being that it's the dissolution of what was previously coherent, what was previously a kind of order or structure or hierarchy. And the nature of the old order, of a healthy social order, in Nietzsche's view, is in fact that situation in which people are used as instruments, as he describes in previous passages. And his point here is clearly not to tell all of us, that's how you should live, you should be an instrument. before disentangling a lot of the Nietzschean value judgments, it is important to just try and see clear-eyed the descriptive picture that Nietzsche is giving us. And then we can argue about his prescriptions later, which I don't think are as important anyway. But the fact remains that, as he says right at the beginning, the freest spirits will be the ones indulging in superstition, or at least they're second-order free spirits, right? The truly free spirit isn't going to get caught up in that. They're not going to, get swept away by some new fringe movement. They will truly be an independent thinker, following their own discernment, right? But the superstitious type is at least closer to the form of the free spirit, like a second-order free spirit. So, in a way, Nietzsche's doing two incredibly subversive things here. He's making democracy synonymous with the breakdown of society. He's also saying that the kind of people that are produced by that breakdown are some of the most valuable people. And indeed, in the passage we just looked at, the paragraph we just looked at, he mentions Caesar, the final tyrant to appear on the stage, and Nietzsche typically has a positive view of Caesar. So, if you're one of those people who gets, again, pearl clutches about decadence and corruption, maybe rethink that from the Nietzschean angle. So let's finish out the passage, actually. Quote, "In these ages, bribery and treason reach their peak, for the love of the newly discovered ego is much more powerful now than the love of the old used-up fatherland, which has been touted to death, and the need to achieve some security from the terrifying ups and downs of fortune opens even nobler hands as soon as anyone who is powerful and rich shows that he is ready to pour gold into them. There is hardly any secure future left. One lives for today, and this state of the soul makes the game easy for all seducers, for one allows oneself to be seduced and bribed only for today, while reserving the future and one's virtue. Individuals, being truly in and for themselves, care, as is well known, more for the moment than do their opposites, the herdmen, for they consider themselves no less incalculable than the future. They also like to attach themselves to violent men because they credit themselves with the capacity for actions and for information that the mass of men would neither understand nor forgive, while the tyrant or Caesar understands the rights of the individual even in his excesses and has a personal interest in advocating and even abetting a bolder private morality. For he thinks of himself and would like others to think of him in the way Napoleon once expressed in his classical manner, I have the right to answer all accusations against me with an eternal, that's me. I am apart from all the world and accept conditions from nobody. I demand subjection even to my fancies, and people should find it quite natural when I yield to this or that distraction. That is how Napoleon once replied to his wife when she had reasons to question the marital fidelity of her husband. The times of corruption are those when the apples fall from the tree. I mean the individuals, for they carry the seeds of the future and are the authors of the spiritual colonization and the origin of new states and communities. Corruption is merely a nasty word for the autumn of a people." End quote. So corruption is just the nasty word for the autumn of a people. And that is, the end of this passage flies in the face of all the people who would be so worried about the decadence and decline of our society, or think that Nietzsche is so attached to the fate of a given civilization or polis. This passage completely should disabuse you of that interpretation of Nietzsche. So corruption is the nasty word for the autumn of a people. So, you take a phrase, a way of naming the phenomenon that makes it sound terrible. Corruption. Nietzsche says it instead in a rather poetic way. The late part of the year for a society, when the fruit falls from the trees. And what does that mean? Well, those tyrannical individuals like Napoleon or Caesar, that is the fruit. Or to use another metaphor, they're like the lightning strike or the long pressure that builds up like an eruption, the flower finally bursting from the soil, the great political genius, the person who shapes and reshapes empires, or who establishes a new political order. That's the fruit of a culture. That's the point of a culture. To give us, as Nietzsche writes elsewhere, 5 or 6 great men. And then he adds, to get over them. Because you never establish that final political order. That's a fantasy. You never get to the 1,000-year Reich, as the Nazis dreamed of. You never get the perpetual peace that Kant hoped for. You never get the Hegelian end of history or the Plato's Republic. These are all fantasies. What you get is a temporary political order that always decays, and in the end, what was its value? Its value is that it throws out or it pitches out one or two great people, or maybe 5 or 6 if you're lucky, right? And so to us conscious beings and as individuals, what should we care about? Should we get super attached to a given culture, especially to our own culture, become misty-eyed for the fatherland? Nietzsche says it's precisely at the moment when that stops stirring anything in anybody anymore that the individual can truly come into being. And I think Nietzsche says he stands on the side of saying that the value is in the extraordinary lives lived, that the value of all the chaos of France was that a man as extraordinary as Napoleon lived. And it's also worth noting, as Nietzsche says elsewhere, all those productions of art and culture and science that we value so much, well, the harvest of all of those things happens during the latter days of a civilization, when that civilization is physically exhausted and is looking for new avenues to vent that creative, destructive power. That's where it goes, is to literature, the arts, music, science, so on. The harvest of a culture is great works and great lives. And, a few quotations from Goethe come to mind, actually, that the real raison d'etre of life is dramatic poetry, without which life is of no use at all. But he also says productivity is not just in plays and poems, but also in deeds. So the harvest of culture is works, lives, deeds. That all comes to fruition right when the culture is just about ready to die. So should we really take such a dim view of corruption or decadence, or do we regard it like the wise person regards the changing of the seasons? And that doesn't mean, again, that you should be blasé or glib. It simply means that you recognize the reality and you choose to see what is beautiful or valuable within that decay, even the beauty that's only possible within that decay, for which that decay is necessary. That is the view of life being promoted here. Without the decadence, without the corruption, you don't get Napoleon. Without the decline in physical strength, you don't get Raphael and Mozart. Somebody could certainly dispute any of those claims, but this is Nietzsche's attitude towards this. And it's an attitude of Nietzsche's that I often see misrepresented, that people think he's one of these traditionalists who's at war with decadence. But again, the entire purpose of the gay science is to see the comedy of existence, to see the totality of existence as a comedy rather than a tragedy. And that is part of the same spirit. All right, let's move on to section 24. Quote, "The weak and quasi-feminine type of the dissatisfied has a sensitivity for making life more beautiful and profound. The strong or masculine type, to stick to this metaphor, has a sensitivity for making life better and safer. The former type manifests its weakness and femininity by gladly being deceived occasionally and settling for a little intoxication and effusive enthusiasm, although it can never be satisfied altogether and suffers from the incurability of its dissatisfaction. Moreover, this type promotes all those who know how to provide opiates and narcotic consolations. And it resents all those who esteem physicians above priests. Thus it assures the continuation of real misery. If this type had not been superabundant in Europe since the Middle Ages, the celebrated European capacity for constant change might never have come into existence, for the requirements of the strong among the dissatisfied are too crude and at bottom so undemanding that eventually they can be surely brought to rest. China, for example, is a country in which the large-scale dissatisfaction and capacity for change have become extinct centuries ago. And the socialists and state idolaters of Europe, with their measures for making life better and safer, might easily establish in Europe, too, Chinese conditions and a Chinese happiness, if only they could first extirpate the sicklier, tenderer, more feminine dissatisfaction and romanticism that at present are still superabundant here. Europe is sick, but owes the utmost gratitude to her incurability and to the eternal changes in her affliction. These constantly new conditions, and these no less constantly new dangers, pains, and media of information have finally generated an intellectual irritability that almost amounts to genius, and is in any case the mother of all genius." End quote. So this is a very stunning passage once you get over the arguably somewhat vague overgeneralizations upon which it is premised about masculine and feminine types. And really, what Nietzsche's talking about, he mentions these are types of the dissatisfied. So he's speaking specifically about two different approaches to one's dissatisfaction. And he attaches the label of masculine and feminine, but we probably know what he means in the micro scale. It's very easy to know what he means. The feminine style of dealing with one's dissatisfaction is to try and numb the pain, and the masculine way of dealing with it is to confront the issue, make life better and safer, as he puts it. And so it's not actually important that we acknowledge a sort of like metaphysical reality to these gendered categories. I would even think that Nietzsche would acknowledge this is a sort of provisional designation, the point of which is not so much to say something about men and women. We could say the cultural connotations associated with men and women are basically assumed. Nietzsche's not saying anything new on this front. He's using these associations with the masculine and feminine to make a point. And it's actually worth noting, much of what Nietzsche says here is actually very similar to what the Chinese would call yin and yang, which is funny because he mentions China in the second half of the passage here. But that's the closest analogy that I think makes sense of Nietzsche's meaning, that yang is active, masculine, aggressive, warm, light, etc. Yin is passive, feminine, yielding, cool, dark, etc. And so when a society deals with its dissatisfaction with social circumstances or, on the micro scale, when one deals with one's own position in society, their dissatisfaction with their place in society, their situation in life, in the feminine sense, they do it by yielding, by accepting it in some sense, and then through illusion trying to sort of cover over with balms and salves. And Nietzsche says with the remedies of the priests, so presumably moral and metaphysical sort of balms and salves, whereas the masculine response is aggression, to confront, change the situation of your dissatisfaction. And so the feminine values the priest over the physician. And remember the old meaning of the term physician in Greek society. The role of the physician was not just to cure the sick, but to prime and perfect the physiology, to optimize the physiology for greater health. In any case, the physician works in the nitty-gritty, the guts and germs and organs and blood that make up the individual. That's what the body is, so long as we're talking about the real world, the physical world. The priest operates in the spiritual world, in our minds, in our imagination, in our feelings. And so a type of civilization that deals with its dissatisfaction in a feminine way would prefer narcotics and opiates, covering over the symptoms, easing the symptoms without addressing the underlying problem. And their dissatisfaction as a result of this is incurable. The problem has gone on so long that it can't be cured. And so a passive approach to health ensures in the end that misery continues indefinitely. And what does Nietzsche associate this with on the level of an entire civilization, in this case Europe? Well, romanticism and sentimentality, things which Nietzsche unequivocally rejects, but which nevertheless he seems to see a kind of advantage to in this passage. This passage doesn't condemn the feminine types. Nietzsche says we owe to this type the celebrated European capacity for change. Well, what does this mean? Well, with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the scientific revolutions, Protestant Reformation, so on and so forth, European societies transformed rapidly over and over again over the course of the past 500 or 600 years or so from Nietzsche's perspective. Whereas in contrast, the counterexample he gives is China, which is inarguably a patriarchal, masculine society, and in a converse fashion has basically repudiated change. And it's a bit funny to think about because Nietzsche's writing from the perspective of the 19th century, and China would undergo some of the most rapid change in history over the course of a century. Some of the most rapid change that any civilization on Earth has ever seen, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that long-term passivity or yielding to one's dissatisfaction as one's mode of being creates this state of perpetual dissatisfaction that's never cured. This misery is prolonged. And then whether by, literal intoxication or the metaphysics of Christianity or whatever. And this is, in another way of speaking, the great tension of the bowstring that Nietzsche writes about in Beyond Good and Evil. And here he says it in a different way. Europe is sick, but because she's so incurably ill, always dissatisfied as a kind of way of being, this dissatisfaction has become a kind of genius. And that is one of the defining traits of Romanticism, that it is an expression of one's dissatisfaction with modernity as it is now, a looking back and a looking to the primordial and to nature and so on and so forth. And so that was sort of the romantic moment is what Europe is waking up from at this time. And Nietzsche says Europe has become a genius of sickness. And it's funny to consider the ways in which Nietzsche might have said some of the same things about himself. We could turn to the preface of this work as a means of decoding this section. Nietzsche accounts his own philosophical depth as derived from his own experiences with sickness, and so too with Europe, the genius of Europe, its almost insane willingness to embrace rapid technological and social change. That in terms of, just speaking in terms of historical fact, that attitude of Europe has transformed the entire world. And Nietzsche says all of this owes to its centuries of dissatisfaction, that kind of sick tension that Europe has been held in. And so it's somewhat similar to the arguments made by theists that, Europe owes the entire modern scientific method to Christianity. But Nietzsche's arguing for maybe from the opposite reasons that the theists might give. That Europe fled from the truth for so long, completely turning away from the physical in terms of the values that were promoted. That fleeing from the truth was the precursor to the total investment in the scientific understanding of the world, which obviously means a study of the physical. And so Nietzsche says, one would have to extirpate that feminine side of the European psyche in order to install what he calls a Chinese regime. And here the term Chinese, again, basically stands for just unchanging. And, that's kind of the place that China occupied in the European mind in the 1800s. They saw that China as a place where the same structure of government and the same beliefs had ruled for thousands of years unchanged. That's not exactly true, but for our purposes, that's what it means. Whereas in Europe, the norm is this intellectual irritability, as Nietzsche calls it, which is part and parcel with modernity. All right, let's move on to number 25. Quote, "Not predestined for knowledge. There is a stupid humility that is not at all rare, and those afflicted with it are altogether unfit to become devotees of knowledge. As soon as a person of this type perceives something striking, he turns on his heel, as it were, and says to himself, 'You have made a mistake. What is the matter with your senses? This cannot, may not be the truth.' And then, instead of looking and listening again, more carefully, he runs away from the striking thing, as if he had been intimidated, and tries to remove it from his mind as fast as he can. For his inner canon says, 'I do not want to see anything that contradicts the prevalent opinion. Am I called to discover new truths? There are too many old ones as it is.'" End quote. This one is fairly self-explanatory. I just want to zero in on this one particularly interesting turn of phrase, stupid humility. It's the kind of humility that paradoxically displays an arrogant kind of confidence in the consensus opinion. And we all know this type of skepticism or intellectual humility, so-called, which is not really skeptical, because a truly skeptical mind would be skeptical even about the consensus. You'd be willing to entertain ideas that may sound crazy or even dangerous to the vast majority of people. This stupid humility, Nietzsche calls it this because it leads people to disbelieve their senses, to disbelieve your lying eyes, so to speak, in favor of the truth of some doctrine which you've decided to believe in prior to any presentation of the evidence. And I think that most average people probably have a dose of this kind of stupid humility. I think it is incredibly common. The act of picking up a perspective and examining it and trying it on without having to commit to it, that's practically unheard of among the herd, which means most people are incapable of actually entertaining views or potential facts that might damage their worldview. There's also just a general psychological tendency, I think, to always assume that whenever somebody has come across something amazing or profound, that well, you can always add that little word, right? Just. Isn't consciousness a beautiful miracle? Well, it's just an emergent property of the brain. Isn't the sunset amazing this evening? Well, it's just the visual manifestation of chemicals in the atmosphere that shouldn't be there. And so sometimes we come across an idea that's intellectually beautiful or stunning, and just like in those statements that kind of attempt to take the poetry and music out of the way we talk about life and make it analytical and reductive, a lot of people will want to discount those new ideas. And they'll frame it as if they're just being cautious, as if they're just being intellectually humble. One example, I heard this a lot when I discussed Peter Turchin's ideas. And whether you think Peter Turchin's ideas are correct or not, I could tell that many people were upset at the idea of a science of history. They've basically been told human beings are too complicated to predict, which is kind of an anti-scientific view. It's rooted in the free will prejudice, obviously. But they would spin it as if you're being the anti-scientific one by making claims or generalizations where you don't have sufficient evidence to make them. Whereas from my perspective, it seems obvious that even if every hypothesis one makes is incorrect in this new science of history, wouldn't you expect that in a new science? Wouldn't the very act of at least posing those hypotheses, attempting to test them by making predictions, wouldn't that be valuable from the scientific angle? Even if you discover nothing at all, you'd learn the value of the experiment. But I could tell that people were just offended that Peter Turchin even presumed to say that the course of a nation or a society's history could be predicted. And their arguments represented themselves as skepticism or humility when in fact the opposite, I think, was the case. They're just repeating the popular moral prejudices, and that colors their understanding of what should be thought possible in science. And they just, it's presented as, again, intellectual humility when really it's a sort of arrogance in the existing dogmas. It's very strange in some way, but in a way, Nietzsche says he has the answer here. Quote, "I do not want to see anything that contradicts the prevalent opinion," end quote. And I think that's a very common desire. I don't even want to see it, right? Assuming that some terrifying truth that contradicts the prevalent opinion exists, most people probably don't want to know about it. They would just prefer to live in ignorance of it. Because to know something that contradicts the knowledge of the collective is a position that most people don't want to be in. They would rather be in the herd than possess knowledge. And so this goes back to one of the early aphorisms of this book, the lack of intellectual conscience, which is the rule and not the exception among human beings. All right, let's move on to 26, which is a very, very important section. This one is entitled, "What is Life?" Quote, "Life, that is, continually shedding something that wants to die. Life, that is, being cruel and inexorable against everything about us that is growing old and weak, and not only about us. Life, that is, then, being without reverence for those who are dying, who are wretched, who are ancient, constantly being a murderer. And yet old Moses said, 'Thou shalt not kill.'" End quote. The ways that life is described here would later be echoed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Life is that which overcomes itself. Life's transformative character is essential to it, and thus life is continually shedding what wants to die. The dying is an inherent part of living, since there's no change, no transformation without dying, without some part of what was passing away. Without this change, you don't have life. What you would have instead would be something like Parmenidean being, an unchanging, static, eternal object, the likes of which we only have ever encountered within the human mind. No, for real life to exist, dying is key, because transformation is key. And so as living beings, we are naturally cruel and inexorable against all that's becoming old and weak within us, like losing your baby teeth or shedding some weak part of your personality, through adopting those virtuous habits that we talked about earlier. A being that's truly alive would celebrate the destruction of those parts of themselves which have to die. And Nietzsche expands this to a kind of attitude towards all life, a kind of hardness to the brutal fact of mortality and a recognition of its necessity. And so being without reverence for those who are dying, which is very impious. But he adds to this, to those who are wretched and who are ancient. In other places, Nietzsche writes about how metaphysical flights of fancy, such as heaven, are the strongest in the minds of the old and the dying. That there's something about idealism, about moral and metaphysical ideas that make them an old man's game. The youth, meanwhile, and we might say the natural state of youth, is forgetful. It's forgetfulness. The youth forget themselves. They forget the world. They do stupid things in the moment. They don't think about the future. What's often said about, young men, 18 to 20-year-old men, they live like they're immortal. They still think they're going to live forever, right? That's when you're 18, you don't go around thinking about your death. And, if you do, that's usually considered a kind of like mental disorder, like high anxiety or something like that. And Nietzsche's argument is basically the young are clearly the healthy ones in this equation. The vigor and the forgetfulness of youth is the healthy state of mind. The sickly state of mind is obviously that which more commonly obtains over the minds of the elderly who are closer to death. So should we really have such a reverence for the thoughts and beliefs and valuations of the old? In every society that looks to the wisdom of its elders, are they not going against life in that way? Trusting in those who are nearer to death, and thus the ones who are always going to be more willing to rationalize death as something good, as the entryway to a new plane of existence. Is that a really good idea, to trust in the wisdom of your elders, right? And so to truly live, as Nietzsche says in this passage, you have to constantly be a murderer. Life feeds on life, as that Tool lyric goes. A lyric from that Tool song, whose name escapes me. But the act of living is the act of taking in nutrients from the environment around you, negating what once was, independently existing, taking it into yourself, making it a part of yourself, murdering other life so that you can survive. And yet, as the Ten Commandments says, given to us by old Moses, a priest from a priestly people, thou shalt not kill. The earliest foundations of the anti-life, anti-natural view of the world. All right, so very short passage, but as I said, it prefigures much of what's said about life in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and there's a lot of meaning packed into that succinct little aphorism. All right, 27. Quote, "The man of renunciation. What does the man of renunciation do? He strives for a higher world. He wants to fly further and higher than all men of affirmation. He throws away much that would encumber his flight, including not a little that he esteems and likes. He sacrifices it to his desire for the heights. This sacrificing, this throwing away, however, is precisely what alone becomes visible and leads people to call him the man of renunciation. It is as such that he confronts us, shrouded in his hood, as if he were the soul of a hair shirt. But he is quite satisfied with the impression he makes on us. He wants to conceal from us his desire, his pride, his intention to soar beyond us. Yes, he is cleverer than we thought, and so polite to us, this man of affirmation. For that is what he is, no less than we, even in his renunciation." End quote. So yet another passage about how we cannot escape being nature's children. That even our philosophies of renunciation, our tragic views of the world that posit a sort of higher purpose for existence, all of this still serves the purposes of nature. So, as Nietzsche would later argue in the Genealogy, and as he remarked upon in Daybreak, the ascetic, the religious practitioner who denies himself worldly pleasure, who starves himself and lives in poverty, dresses in rags, spends hours a day in contemplation or in meditation, devotes his entire life to God, maybe even self-flagellates or punishes himself in some way. What does this type of human being get out of this way of life? Well, he attains a kind of power. The power the ascetic holds is that his rejection of everything that the worldly type of person seeks after has this effect of placing him above the worldly man, even up to and including the king, the conqueror, the political genius. The warrior aristocracies, Nietzsche argued, always looked to the ascetics, the monks and the martyrs, with a kind of awe, because they did something that no one could understand, that seemed to give them no advantage, no personal or material advantage anyway. They subject themselves to the worst pains and deprivations, showed this remarkable discipline. And so this all implies there must be a reason why they're willing to bear these pains. There must be some why that gives them the ability to do what they do. There must be a secret source of their power. The ascetic must be able to draw on some power, therefore, that the warrior aristocrat cannot. And when the warrior asks the ascetic what his source of power is, he's happy to tell him it's the Holy Spirit. He tells him in the West, right? Or in China, he might say it's the illumination of Vairocana Buddha, right? He sources his power to some great being or force that is set above all mankind. And so these are the heights that the man of ascetic practice reaches by renouncing the worldly. He strives for this higher world. And yet the critique here, the point, again, very similar to the point Nietzsche made about selfishness in section 21, the first section we covered today. The ascetic renounces everything except he cannot renounce the desire to set himself above all the rest of us. That is his pride, his vanity. That is what drives his spiritual quest. And so, just like selflessness is preached out of selfishness, the ascetic renounces the world out of a desire to rule it. And as Nietzsche would later argue, this is exactly what the ascetics succeeded in doing, establishing a counter-aristocracy to those established by the warrior classes, just as the Brahmins superseded the Kshatriyas in India and the popes and bishops superseded the kings in Latin Christendom. Well, that's a complicated picture, but you know what I mean. So we'll move on to section 28. Quote, "To be harmful with what is best in us. At times our strengths propel us so far forward that we can no longer endure our weaknesses and perish from them. We may even foresee this outcome without wishing to have it otherwise. Thus we become hard against everything in us that desires consideration, and our greatness is also our lack of compassion. Such inexperience, for which we must pay in the end with our lives, is a parable for the whole effect of great human beings on others and on their age, precisely with what is best in them, with what only they can do. They destroy many who are weak, unsure, still in the process of becoming, of striving, and thus they are harmful. It can even happen that, everything considered, they are only harmful because what is best in them is accepted and absorbed by those alone whom it affects like a drink that is too strong. They lose their understanding and their selfishness and become so intoxicated that they are bound to break their limbs on all false paths on which their intoxication leads them astray." End quote. So as Neil Young said, it's better to burn out than to fade away. This happens to many artists. They become great, they become famous and wealthy and influential because of their talents, which one would say is the best part of themselves. But that allows them to perish from their worst aspects. What does that mean? Well, the 27 Club comes to mind. All of those stars who perished at a young age from drug overdose. Why did they all die at that age? Well, there's nothing particularly special about that age. It's just that people typically become famous in the music industry or acting when they're in their early 20s, and then they become anxious and depressed and empty as an effect of that fame, which usually takes a couple years to kick in. They attempt to fill that void with drugs, and after several years of that, with no financial breaks in their drug habit, they die. Because what stops many, many people from killing themselves with drugs is the simple fact that drugs are expensive, and you can't always get them. And if you're rich and famous, you can have them all the time, and that's the worst thing that can happen to an addict. And the reason why this happens a lot is that artists are generally selfish people. That's part of why they're able to become successful artists. Interwoven with their best qualities are their worst qualities. And, again, best and worst here are kind of relative, but, in a way that their success is dependent on a character flaw seen from a certain perspective. Basically, the person who can become very arrogant and self-absorbed enough to reshape the world into their artistic vision, that is someone who will also be very prone to self-destructive habits, the kind of habits that one engages in out of pure hedonism and is less likely to engage in when they have a sense of responsibility or duty to other human beings. And perhaps most interestingly, you can embrace this course in life even though you know it's going to happen. Like you might have a sense somewhere deep down, this is not the right thing for me. But if you're tyrannized over, if you're the victim of some drive or virtue, it's fated to happen, in other words. And when an individual is great enough, they might not only destroy their own life, but the lives of others. Their charisma might be such that they're like an intoxicant, making others drunk on their irrational magnetism or what have you. That's sort of what Nietzsche talks about in the second half of this passage. And there's a few examples of this. I mean, you could even look to the example of Nietzsche and Peter Gast. I mean, Gast is a composer. He sometimes complained that he couldn't get anything done on his own work, his own music, because he's too busy being Nietzsche's secretary and editor, basically taking down the dictation for Nietzsche's books. Nietzsche monopolized the man's time for many years, and probably, well, almost certainly stunted Gast's career. But Gast went right along with this. I mean, he could have told Nietzsche no, but he didn't. He felt Nietzsche to be a great man. What would another example be? Well, I mean, okay, I don't think his life was ruined by it, but Goethe and Eckermann. I mean, certainly Eckermann didn't feel that way. But Eckermann spends a long period of his life, arguably the best years of his life, basically just hanging on to Goethe's every word and jotting down everything that he can remember that Goethe said. I mean, he's basically living in service of immortalizing Goethe because he believes that Goethe is a great man. And Nietzsche surely saw how Wagner had the same effect on many people, how he used and dragged along those around him in his inner circle. I don't know. I think Nietzsche certainly saw how this could happen. I've been mostly teasing out this metaphor in the arts, but it can certainly happen in politics as well. Sort of any kind of great human endeavor, this could happen. So let's look at one final section this week before we conclude. It's another change of topic, though many of the same themes are present here that we've been discussing throughout, the same underlying psychological themes. This is section 29, entitled Add Lies. Quote, when people in France began to attack the Aristotelian unities, and others therefore began to defend them, one could see once again what is to be seen so often, but what people hate to see. One lied, mendaciously inventing reasons for these laws simply to avoid admitting that one had become used to these laws and no longer wanted things to be different. The same process occurs, and has always occurred, in every prevalent morality and religion. The reasons and purposes for habits are always lies that are added after some people begin to attack these habits and to ask for reasons and purposes. At this point, the conservatives of all ages are thoroughly dishonest. They add lies. End quote. So the Aristotelian unity of time, setting, and plot, that's what this is, that was demanded by Aristotelian tragedy. And arguments were made for changing this understanding of tragedy, and arguments were made against changing it. But the reasons given, Nietzsche says, matter-of-factly here, are simply made up. The conservatives who wanted to keep things as they were simply didn't want things to change. And we can all understand that. I mean, how often have you been confronted by a big change, and you don't know why you don't like it? It's just that you don't like it. The thought of that change bothers you, and you start, what? You start looking for reasons. And it's funny that we do that just in general, isn't it? That you know something bothers you, that you don't like something, and then we feel the need to ask ourselves, why? Why don't I like that? And then we try to find a reason. And why would we think that we would actually be finding reasons instead of inventing reasons? Irrfinden instead of finden in German. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. But it's finding and inventing have that sort of like cognate relationship in German, which is very interesting. And Nietzsche makes it clear. His point doesn't just concern the Aristotelian convention, which, I mean, that doesn't really matter to anyone any longer. The passage isn't really about that. The point is that in all ages, those who stand on the side of keeping things the same, which that group will always exist because that is usually a herdish position, and it's more comfortable and pleasurable for things to stay the same, They will be confronted with change, they won't like it, and then they'll invent reasons for why things ought not to change. And Nietzsche is provocative by calling those reasons lies. I think it should be said in many cases, we trick ourselves into believing those lies. We want to bring to mind some justification why our dislike of a given change is valid. We want to prove it to ourselves just as much as we want to argue the position to our opponent. And these are post hoc justifications, those reasons that we find when we try to think of a reason for something that we already feel on a visceral level. These reasons that we find will present themselves as if they're just spontaneous happenings, as if they were something that we found, that we happened upon. But again, it's just interesting to consider. It's worthwhile to consider that entire mental structure, that whole mental operation, when we feel that we have to justify something, prove something, when really the feeling does not need a justification, it doesn't need a proof. And there's a difference between trying to understand where a feeling is coming from with a sort of like psychological clarity in order to come to a sort of descriptive analysis of why I'm feeling a certain way about something. What we're really talking about here, though, is when you say, well, let's just use an example of a person. You say, I don't like that person. I can't figure out why. A lot of the mental labor that you're doing is trying to figure out why it's okay for you not to like that person. You're not actually trying to figure out like, oh, well, that guy, let's just use like a really easy example. That guy looks like my late father and he was an abusive asshole. And so that's why I don't like him. It's not fair to that person at all. He just happens to resemble somebody that, was traumatic to me in my past. What I'm really talking about here is you say, well, I don't like that guy. Why don't I like him? Oh, it's because he's loud and obnoxious. That's why. But, in any case, the broader point is that the feeling is, in some sense, an end unto itself and does not need any further proof or justification. That is, the feeling springs out of an impulse or a drive which is itself pre-rational, and then we try and rationalize it. And that's sort of the function of consciousness, and that's why we incline towards that kind of analysis, trying to find the reason for why we feel a certain way and make it sensible and justifiable to ourselves. And so, a Nietzschean ought to know better. Part of what Nietzsche offers us is the mental framework in order to recognize every thought as a drive speaking to you, a different desire or impulse articulating itself and raising itself into your consciousness. And it's another reason why, as we've been talking about from the beginning of this read-through, consciousness itself is inherently, essentially, a flawed and dishonest faculty. We continually trick ourselves. We treat the consciousness as independent and thus as separable from the body, and therefore as something that can act autonomously. And as long as we do that, we'll continue to trick ourselves. Once we've moved past that kind of superstition, mind-body dualism, which is really just another form of the soul superstition, the ego superstition, then we would always have to ask, from where in my body did that thought come? What in me is thinking this thought, is giving me this reason, is rendering this explanation for my behaviors or my feelings? And once you begin to ask those kinds of questions, and hopefully with a healthy sense of humor about it all, willing to entertain possibly embarrassing or uncomfortable possibilities about yourself and your own thoughts, well, at that point, you're doing the work of the gay science. You're coming one step closer to being that kind of person who, as Nietzsche says, can laugh out of your whole self and at your whole self. All right, well, that's all for this week, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me yet again. We only have a few more episodes of Book 1 before we will return to the regular season episodes and begin Season 5. I did an episode where I kind of talked about this before, but just in case you're not up to speed, we're going to do this book by book and then and not just do the entirety of the gay science in one run, because that would take a long time. So we're not going to do that. So we're going to finish out Book 1. Originally, I think I'd planned on doing Book 1 and 2 together, but I think we're just going to take it book by book. That makes the most sense to me, and just however long it takes. But we're going to have regular episodes on other topics in between that. So just a couple more episodes of this book, and then we'll get into broader topics. But yeah, All right. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.